minute. The next item would be the approval of the minutes from October 12th. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
A motion by Mayor Couts, a second by?
Second.
This is
by Jerry Zhao. Bridget, will you take the roll on the approval of the minutes from October 12th?
Mary Liz Holberg,
Yes.
Peter Bell. Peter Bell.
There's Doug.
Pat Bourne. Pat Bourne.
Yes.
Jay Coles.
Aye.
Pahua Yang Hoffman.
Aye.
Jim Hovland.
Aye.
Elizabeth Couch.
Aye.
Doug Loon.
Aye.
Mary Jo McGuire.
Aye.
Connie Subjam.
Aye.
George Schember.
Aye.
Aline Shurama.
Aye.
Tom Weaver. Tom Weaver. Janet Williams.
Aye.
Jerry Zhao.
Aye.
All right, thank you, everybody. So we're going to head into the business portion of our meeting now. We have a variety of presentations from organizations that have looked at the Met Council issue in the past and have a stake in its operations. But before that, I just want to check with committee members. Are there any items, information, questions before we get started? All right, seeing none, we've asked each of the presenters to limit their testimony to 5 minutes, and then we'll have time to question if there's particular questions for each presenter. And the first group on our agenda is the Metro Cities, and Patty Nauman, their executive director, will be presenting. So other than Patty, I think if we all mute, that might help with feedback, et cetera. So welcome to the committee, Patty.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I just want to be sure you can see and hear me. Perfect. Okay, got it. Thank you. So thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony to the Blue Ribbon Committee on the Metropolitan Council this afternoon. I did send some background information to the committee, so I will just provide some highlights from that and some additional details on the association and its policies that are relevant to the work of this group. So Metro Cities, just very briefly, was established in 1974, and it was formed at a little bit after, but its beginnings were at the same time that the Metropolitan Council was established. And a very primary reason for the creation of the association was to provide representation of the shared interests of cities at the Metropolitan Council. In essence, to really serve as the city watchdog at the council. The reason for that is that since its inception, the work of the Metropolitan Council and the work of cities have many intersections. Cities are responsible for implementing much of what comes out of the Metropolitan Council and thus consider themselves to be the primary constituency of the council. The policies of the association cover, we are also a legislative lobbying association for cities in the metropolitan area, but our policies on the Metropolitan Council encompass the entire scope of the work of the council, from the SAC charge to livable communities programs to water supply, to density, to comprehensive planning, and to regional governance, as well as transit, inflow and infiltration, and the entire gamut. As I said, Metro Cities is often called the watchdog of the Metropolitan Council. I would also say that it strives to work very collaboratively with the council. It strives to serve as the city liaison to the council. Again, there is much intersection in the work between both the regional government and local governments. Metro Cities does watch monitor all aspects of the policy and funding activity of the council and does respond in a manner consistent with the association's policies. I also wanted to just touch very briefly on some of the key policies of the association that I believe are relevant to the work that you are doing as a committee. And I have included those in your packet, but I will just provide additional detail. First, Metro Cities does have a comprehensive policy on the goals and principles for regional governance. And largely what that policy says is that we do recognize that the Metropolitan Council was created to manage the growth of the metropolitan area in an orderly fashion, and that cities are responsible for adhering to those regional systems as plans as they plan for their own local growth and service delivery. Again, cities see themselves as the council's primary constituency, with growth being primarily managed through city comprehensive planning and implementation, and as well as the delivery of a wide range of public services. Metro Cities does believe that the council must be accountable to and work in collaboration with city governments, and that really is a common thread of all of the policies that govern the association with respect to the Metropolitan Council. The Metro Cities does have a position on regional governance, on the structure of the Metropolitan Council. It has long studied the governance of the council and has had a long-standing position that essentially supports the appointment of members by the governor with 4-year staggered terms. That's in place in the policy of the association because Metro Cities believes that it is important to stabilize ideological shifts on the council and to provide for continuity of knowledge. I believe that's appropriate for a long-range planning body. Metro Cities also does strongly support and has taken a look at adding more transparency to the nominating process. That has been a critique of cities over the years. That includes increasing the size of the nominating committee, making sure that any nominees that are recommended before they are appointed have been made public prior to their appointment. And we also support basically that the committee does have a majority of local officials on it. Metro Cities does oppose having local elected officials on the Metropolitan Council. That has been I'm sure you're well aware that has been a major point of discussion at the legislature in the last several years. There are a variety of reasons for the association's opposition to that model of governance for the council. I will say here, and I'm happy to answer any further questions on it and provide more detail, but essentially, Metro Cities believes that those roles are incompatible due to the nature of the work of the Metropolitan Council and the nature of work of city officials. And keep in mind, these are city officials that have taken this position. They have recognized that the council must work collaboratively with local officials, and our policies support that throughout our entire policies on the council, but cities do oppose having local elected officials on the council. Further, with respect to the work of this committee, Metro Cities does support the model of the Transportation Advisory Board and the Technical Advisory Committee that assists the TAB. The association's board of directors has statutory appointing authority for the municipal members of the TAB and the TAC. And we do support that model of, and that's part of an advisory structure that is one of many that the association supports as an example of how municipal officials and of course other stakeholders can work collaboratively with the council and provide input to its work in a structured fashion.
Okay, you're gonna need to wrap up.
Okay, quickly, thank you, Madam Chair. With regional transit, I know that's a focus of conversation. Metro Cities, just very quickly, we support a multimodal transit system. We support the ability of all providers, including the opt-outs, to be able to provide the level of service that they need to, and so that they can provide for the diversity of needs in the metropolitan region. So we do oppose any constraints to the ability of all providers to provide transit in the region. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Yeah. Committee members, are there any questions for Ms. Nauman? Connie.
Just a quick one. What does watchdog mean?
Madam Chair and members, thank you very much. Basically, what that means is sort of a term of a term that's been used by the association for many years. And really what it means is Metro Cities keeps a close eye on the work of the council. And the reason for that is cities, because of the nature of the work of the regional body and the work that cities must then do following whatever policy and funding activity comes out of that regional structure, the Metropolitan Council. The job of the association is to make sure that cities' needs, sort of their circumstances, are accounted for in the council's policy making. So really what it means is we keep a very close eye on the work of the council. And that does mean that we watch their committee meetings, whether it's the full council or the environment committee, the community development committee, the water supply committee, the tab. We do keep close tabs, and we keep our cities informed about the council's work.
All right, thank you. Mayor Hovland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Patty, thanks for being with us today. One of the positions that Metro Cities has adopted is that you disfavor local elected officials on the Met Council, but you recognize that of the 34 members on the tab, where the chair and I sit, the majority of those are elected officials. How do you make that distinction between what goes on at the tab relative to the majority of those folks being elected officials, and what could go on at the Met Council if that was composed of elected officials?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mayor Hovland. So Metro Cities has examined that question and been asked that question previous when we were at the Capitol. Basically, the Transportation Advisory Board is an advisory board to the Metropolitan Council, and it serves, of course, a very important function. But the reality is it is an advisory body, and that is a distinction that the association makes with respect to local elected officials. If you were to ask local elected officials to go beyond the work of that advisory body and to actually sit on the Metropolitan Council. The Metropolitan Council, first of all, has, as you know, a variety of functions that go beyond transportation. But if you were to actually require local officials to perform the duties of the Metropolitan Council, that is a whole different level of work. It is a whole different level of conflict. As an advisory body, there is still a separateness between the local officials that are on that body and others, and the Metropolitan Council itself, because the Metropolitan Council is ultimately responsible for those decisions. And the association makes that important distinction. If you were to have city officials actually serving on the Metropolitan Council, you end up with, the Metropolitan Council, among other things, is a regulator. City officials, like it or not, are regulated by the council. Cities are. Those are that puts cities in untenable positions to reconcile those conflicts. And local officials, their fiduciary commitment is to their local city, not to the Metropolitan Council. So the tab still allows for that separation for those local officials in a way that having local officials on the council would not.
All right, thank you. Does that, we've got our 10 minutes for Metro Cities. Unless there's a burning question, I would like to move on to the next presenters. All right, not seeing any additional questions. Thank you, Patty. And the next group is the Citizens League, and two of our members will be making the presentation. It's my understanding there is a PowerPoint as well that Greg will put up. But Pat and Bahua, if you want to take it from here, that would be great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just give Greg here a minute to set that up. Madam Chair, members, and special guests, my name is Bahua Yang Hoffman. I'm at the St. Paul, Minnesota Foundation now, but in my prior role, I was the executive director of the Citizens League. And in 2015, when we started the Citizens League Met Council Task Force, I was then the Citizens League Policy Director. I'm joined today in my presentation with fellow Blue Ribbon Committee member Pat Bourne, who is the current Citizens League Board Chair. Oh, I think they're advancing too fast. Can we go back to the first slide, please?
Yeah, it's got an auto advance programmed into it, so I'll try to keep it to where you need it if possible.
Sorry. Thank you, Greg.
Yep.
For those unfamiliar, Citizens League was started in 1952 as a member-based, nonpartisan nonprofit focused on good government and policy making, bringing together community members and former policymakers.
Pahua, sorry to interrupt you. It's when they built the PowerPoint, they put a auto advance in it, and in this mode, I can't change it.
Oh dear.
And I can't really control much of it. So it's got.
I can just okay. Sorry about that, Greg. I didn't realize that that was built in. I will talk fast and see if I can keep up with the auto. Before I move on, Kat, did you have anything?
On the presentation mode, that may work. If we.
Yeah, Greg, maybe take it out of presentation mode and we can just.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then it will work.
Thank you, Jerry. Pat, while Greg is getting that, would you like to say anything as an opening before I get going on the rest of the slides, Pat?
Well, as you're going to see, or if you haven't already seen from the other slides, the League did something very similar to what we are all doing right now. And the makeup of the study committee that the League created is very similar in makeup by way of representation of parties as we have here. And in some respects, the scope of what the League was attempting to do is similar to what we're aimed at doing here. So it's very much in parallel just about 5 years ago. And in fact, more than just Pahua and I are in common. Mayor Couts, Peter Bell were also members of this Citizens League Study Committee in 2015.
All right, Greg, did we fix that? We can just advance the screen like this if you just want to enlarge this. Perfect. All right, so second slide, overview of my presentation today is to go over the little bit of Citizens League history, and I think most of you know that a Citizens League 1967 report led to the creation of the Met Council. And this little image here, this clip is from the Minneapolis Star, indicating that in 1967, the Citizens League was going to present its work on metropolitan affairs. So a little bit of history here. Why the Citizens League started a task force in 2015 and who was a part of it. As all of you now know, it's not new to study the Met Council and make recommendations for changes to the Met Council. In 2015, what led the Citizens League to start a task force was that, from time to time, the Citizens League did take up study just to see how the Met Council was doing. So this was not new. But what was new was in 2015, 4 counties got together to hire a federal lobbyist to make the case to the U.S. Department of Transportation about whether or not the Met Council was complying with federal rules requiring a body and majority of elected officials. This did pique the interest of Citizens League members, and who came to us and asked us if it was time for a new study on Met Council governance, which is what led us to do so. And who was a part of the 19-member task force, as Pat Bourne just said, Peter Bell and Mayor Couts were part of this 19-member task force. You can find it also in the Citizens League 2015 report, which I just put in the chat box. And I believe it's on page 26 of that final report. It was also in the PDF document that I sent ahead to the entire Blue Ribbon Committee last week, I believe. And then what led to the charge of the committee was a discussion among the members. What we aimed to do was to review and understand the history of the Met Council. We wanted to develop a shared vision for the Met Council and, if possible, develop a set of actionable solutions to address the concerns that we had heard while persisting to represent the Met Council's regional view. And all the task force member agreed that the criteria for recommendations should include it be politically plausible and implementable, which is key. So in a second, when I go over the recommendations, just know that we thought really hard and long about making sure the recommendations were politically plausible and implementable, and that it honors the criticism and addresses them and that it continues to represent the Met Council as a regional entity with a regional mindset. So those were our criteria for recommendations. Okay, next slide. For key findings, the committee found that Met Council continued to be an important regional advocate, which is really important despite the criticism that it's received, but that the current governance structure inhibits the Met Council's ability to effectively plan for the long term. And the reason for this is that the council members' term run alongside the governors, and that the turnover with every new governor can be and was disruptive to long-term planning, its long-term planning mission. And also the council being accountable to the governor raised questions about independence. And then the third bullet here, there were changing demographics and growing poverty in the region. And the group thought there should be important consideration, that these should be important considerations as it informs policymaking. Next slide. Of the systems under the Met Council's purview, transportation governance did generate the most questions and concerns. And I'll talk a little bit later about how this translated to our recommendation. The group also agreed that water, while not, yeah.
With this, Mary Liz, so even allowing for a couple minutes with the technical difficulties, were like at the 5 minutes, so I'm gonna need to get you to move along.
Okay, why don't we, this is the end of the findings part, so let's move on to the recommendations. So the group recommended the 4-year staggered terms, and we wanted to strengthen the member selection process. And we also thought that the council actually had more authority than it was using, and we wanted it to fully exercise the council's current authority to reduce concentrations of poverty and foster increased connections. And what I will say here in closing is that in 2019, Governor Walz did largely adopt these recommendations, except for the 4-year staggered terms. He did adopt the recommendations to strengthen the nominations committee process. Mary Janet Williams, member of the Blue Ribbon Committee, and I both served on that nominations committee. That is all I have, Madam Chair, members.
All right, Pat, did you want to add anything before we go to questions?
No, I don't.
Okay, any questions by committee members? Jerry.
Madam Chair, my question for Papa is any particular reason that the staggering term recommendation was not adopted?
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I think
go ahead, Pat.
I think we can just speculate about what the legislature and the governor can agree on. I'll speculate myself that governance changes at the Met Council are likely to be part of some bigger picture deal that's negotiated between the legislature and the governor on a whole variety of issues that might include this. It probably won't start with Met Council governance, would be my guess, but it might include that. And there just wasn't enough willingness to come to terms on all the other topics that might be put into a bigger set of agreements about the Met Council. But others can speculate too.
Well, I think historically too, it would be unusual to see this kind of reform in the middle of a governor's term whenever, at least from my experience, when things were passed, they were passed to be implemented or started in the next governor's term. So I would think more likely to see reforms in the second biennium of a 4-year term than a first. So any other questions for the Citizens League folks? All right, if not, I think we'll move on to the Suburban Transit Association. And I got Councilmember Hoopaw from Apple Valley and Luther from MVTA, Minnesota Valley Transit Authority.
Good afternoon, committee. Unfortunately, Clint had he had an emergency meeting today, so he's not able to attend. He
Oh,
passed
I'm
on.
sorry to hear that.
Yeah. So I'll take it away, and I'll be respectful of everyone's time.
Perfect. Thank you.
So just want to obviously we provided some handouts as well as some just PowerPoint in advance. Just want to start off with just reiterating that the spirit of this we'll talk about from Suburban Transit Association: innovation, success, and continue to be a seat at the table in a full partnership. Let's slides to the next slide if Greg can. Just a history. I know not everyone's familiar with maybe what the Suburban Transit Association. Suburban communities saw legislation in 1982 to create transit agencies to serve the fast-growing areas in the suburbs. The legislative auditor back in 2011, which I know you guys had a recap on that a couple weeks ago, reported that the existing planning structure was not responsive to the need for the service plan, which would address the transit needs, particularly in the growing suburbs. That's one of the reasons why suburban transit, why cities opted out at that particular time. Some calls opt out, some calls replacement services, but that is why some of the suburban communities decided to obviously go a different route when it came to providing transit. Down to history. Before STA was formed, several suburbs were paying into the transit system, but they weren't receiving service. It's important to note that in 2016 analysis, and we're currently looking at 2020, and still holds true today, that suburban communities within the Suburban Transit Association contribute more than 10% of invest funding, but we only receive about 4%. It's important to understand when we say 10%, we mean 10% of overall statewide invest funding. Obviously, the region does not receive 100% of invest funding. The region receives 40% of invest, but we actually contribute 10% overall statewide and only receive about 5% to 4% of the funding in return to our suburban communities. You can kind of scroll down for me, please. You can have the next one. So when we talk about effective service, right, I think this is really, it's about transit, whether it's operated by Metro Transit, the council, or suburban providers, has to be effective. STA has been a productive contributor to the region transit system, as developed close relationship with the communities that we serve. Suburban transit agencies have been known for innovations. The legislative auditor highlighted that from our pilot test, one being our most recent one, Route 495, which serves Mall of America down to Shakopee, started in 2016, and now accounts for over 4%, almost 5% of MBTA's total ridership. But those new approaches to technology have been a hallmark of our particular service. Next slide. When it comes to Employment Lifeline, connecting customers to employment centers in suburban communities and downtown areas, as we know, when we look at the transit study 2040, more new jobs are coming to the suburbs and urban core in the next 30 years. Innovation is important to understand that there are public-private partnerships. MBTA is first in the region to partner with private employers in order to provide public-private funding, provide public transit to those entities. Microtransit, Southwest has been one of the leaders in Southwest in microtransit. They've actually received a request and gave technical assistance internationally as far as was New Zealand. One of the first in the region, not the country, to pilot their successful Southwest Prime. Mixed-use development, you'll see in Maple Grove, as well as in Southwest service area. In a transit-oriented development, and our first transit app in the region. Next one. I think the hallmark to any good service is looking at the customer representation. Overall, consistently across the board, suburban providers receive satisfaction rates of 95% or higher from our customer base, as well as we continue to have exceptional safety records where accidents and ADA compliance are incidents below 1% based on ridership and revenue hours. That's a testament to the hard work and the efficient service we put on the street. Next slide for me. To sum it up, and I know there's three, we'll touch a little bit on governance. STA should receive, still we believe that we should receive an equitable proportional share of transit funding for the region. STA favors a governance that is more accountable to the region and is structured to ensure suburban communities are directly represented. And innovation success and the service of STA can be enhanced as a full partner with a seat at the table. That time I'll close. Are there any questions?
Madam Chair, this is Jay Cole.
Sorry, that's me. Mayor Couch, did you have a question? Anybody else have a question?
Madam Chair, this is Jay Coles. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, I appreciate the mismatch between revenues provided by the suburban districts. I'm uncertain if they're counties per se that are covered by your services. How, and then the receipt of funds in turn from MVest. How exactly are those funds spent that MVest would be returning to your districts? Are they being given to counties? I mean, they're not going directly to STA, I assume.
No.
Jay, there is a formula of total MVest, and then part of it goes to Met Council for general transit service, and of that, a portion of it, I think, I was trying to look for the exact numbers. It was in our presentations earlier, but what is it, Judd? Is it 40% goes to transit, and then of that, a portion goes to the opt-outs?
That's right. So when the motor vehicle sales tax was dedicated to transportation, of the 100%, it's no more than, well, statutorily it's broke up that 60% goes to MnDOT, 40% goes to transit. Greater Minnesota Transit of that 40% gets 4%. So, and then metropolitan area transit gets 36%.
Suburban transit receives 4%.
And then, yes, and so if you look at the 36% of transit, of motor vehicle sales tax that goes to the metro area, the suburban transit providers are getting a dedicated portion of that, which my understanding, it's probably close to 10, 11%.
Yeah, back in 2018, just to clarify, in 2018, we received 10% of regional funding, but we actually contribute 10% of statewide funding. So as you look at currently today, we're looking at 2020 calculation. Suburban communities, 13 communities which we represent: Apple Valley, Burnsville, Eagan, Rosemont, Savage, Prior Lake, Shakopee, Chaska, Chanhassen, Eden Prairie, Maple Grove, and Plymouth have contributed about $65 million in invest statewide as of 2020, October 2020. We'll be lucky as an association of those 13 cities to receive $30 million back in order to invest to put in transit services in those communities.
And Luther, when you come up with that 65 million, is that total MVest or
total invest? Total invest.
Right. So I mean, less than half of the MVest is going to transit. Jay, did Jay, did we come close to answering your question, or did we just totally confuse you?
No, I think that was very helpful. As I understand it, this is actually funds that are being returned to the service providers in the opt-out areas, correct?
Right, and there are a subset.
That answers that question, but the rest of the background is also interesting. I appreciate it.
Right, and so the suburban transit providers are a subset of counties. They're generally broken up by cities. So for instance, in Dakota County, we have MVTA cities, we have Metro Transit cities, and we have cities that are outside of the transit taxing district that don't. So it's kind of soup to nuts in almost every county.
Right, and I would, sorry, Mary Liz, I would also add that, you know, the Metropolitan Council pays for much of the capital costs that go toward that through the regional transit capital levy that we talked about through the presentation that was given by Matt Burris last week as well, or the last time we met as well. So there is a distinction between capital and operating costs that needs to be pointed out there as well, because it isn't just an apples to apples comparison there.
And I think the other point is we're trying to gather budget data from the different providers that'll be provided to this community committee, and that will help us kind of dig deeper into this, what portion of the funding comes from fairs, state money, local money. We'll get a better picture once we see some of these operating cost models and budgets from the various providers, well, both Metro Transit and the Suburban Transit providers. So I thought, Aline, do you have a question?
Well, I just had a kind of a little bit of a follow-up. Maybe it's more of a comment / question, but just in terms of, I mean, I could see, I think Luther's point about those communities kind of being net exporters of MVEST dollars that go to the rest of the state rather than coming back to those suburban communities. I wonder if that's also true for the Metro versus Greater Minnesota. Like that same kind of pattern is also occurring. I mean, you see that with gas tax nationally. There are some states that are kind of like net contributors to gas tax and they get less back. So I wonder if that's also the case just in general for the rest of the Metro, not just, it's not unique to the suburban communities, is my comment.
No, I mean, I think, I know my mom always told me life's not fair. And I think in government funding, I think you can say that across the whole spectrum that it's not, I mean, but again, I think that we'll be able to, once we get some recent operating costs, subsidies, et cetera, we'll be able to see, have some hard figures to kind of compare some of these things. So we'll get there. Jerry, question?
Yeah, Madam Chair, just a quick comment in response to Arlene's comment. Actually, it happened to the case that my team has done some research, but it's more the statewide in terms of transit. Clearly, as the metro area gets more, but in terms of highway, it's the other way around. When the two things combine together, actually really even. It's kind of even up. It's a very interesting pattern out there.
Well, and we're also going to take a peek at our next meeting at paratransit or ADA and how it's funded differently in the metropolitan area versus greater Minnesota, which there's no rhyme or reason or fairness in that realm either. So, George, you look like you might have a question as well.
I'm not looking for an answer, but I wonder if this is truly a governance issue or an issue related to how we set up the rules or the practices across how these dollars are apportioned. So that's what's going through my head.
Well, I think that it's hard to separate money and governance when, you know, who's making the decision about where the money goes and how it's spent is a function of governance, I think. So,
and it's important also to note that the Suburban Transit are sub-recipients of the Metropolitan Council. So when it comes to, in terms of funding, anything beyond the 3.74% that's dedicated in state statute, it's clearly at the discretion of the council how it's distributed to the providers. So it does deal with the governance and overall structure of the council on our standpoint.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and I think that what you would hear from the suburban transit providers is that in some ways they compete, but they're at the mercy of Metro Transit. And so there's a lot of control. We recently saw Met Council taking over the operation of the Red Line, which was a line that was being operated by MVTA. That caused consternation. So I think at the very least, it's a friction point that this commission should be aware of. So any other questions for Luther? All right, thank you. We will move on. Thank you to the Council of Metropolitan Area Leagues of Women Voters. That's a mouthful. And we've got Karen Schaefer, who's the chair, who used to be a Dakota County person.
Nice to see you, Madam Chair.
Nice to see you too. Go ahead, time's yours.
Okay, I'm going to try to stick within the 5. The Council of Metropolitan Area Leagues Women Voters. Next slide. No, too fast. There we are. It's an interleague organization, basically organized under the League of Women Voters of the United States. We were created in 1962, and our purpose is to focus on government issues of the metropolitan area, basically in educating our members and the public with respect to regional government. It's political and nonpartisan, as all league groups are. The most important point on this screen, though, is we are a membership organization. There are 19 chapters in the metro area, and all of the members of those chapters, they are our membership. So we're not a staff organization. We're just a membership organization. Next slide. So in August through December of 2018, we undertook a study of Metropolitan Council governance. It was in the air, of course, at that time. And we wanted to educate our members about the issues. So we had a study committee, a group of eight people who ran the committee, and we did interviews. We interviewed Pat Nauman and Aline and Paula, and also Kathleen Salzman from the Transparency Initiative. And we heard also from Deb Dyson, Keith Carlson, Charlie Vander Aarde, and C. Terrence Anderson from Cura. And we did a literature review, of course. But the big thing that we did that nobody else has done is we unleashed 30 teams of members across the metro area to interview local government officials, some elected, some appointed, to ask them what they thought about the governance and effectiveness of the Metropolitan Council. So when we issued our report in January 2019, it had two main parts. One is all the results of the interviews and the standardized questionnaire that we used are in the report. So if you're curious as to which mayors and council members and planning directors were interviewed and the names of all the interviewers, those are all in the report. So it has a little bit of granular detail, and it gives some ideas of what local officials are feeling about the Metropolitan Council, at least at that time. And the local elected officials and the appointed officials were generally quite satisfied with the sewer system, the transportation, livable communities, environmental cleanup grants, research, forecasting, and planning assistance. The Metropolitan Council was seen as less effective with respect to communication, interaction with cities, public perception. There were some transit issues, and there was concern with the comprehensive planning process because it's onerous and inflexible. But we urge you to read the report for the granular detail. Next slide. So in January of 2019, all of our local chapters had meetings, in-person meetings pre-pandemic, to discuss the issues of metropolitan governance that we had researched. And the pros and cons of each position were in our written paper, and that report, I believe, has been made available to you. And at each local meeting, and all the members who attended got to weigh in and vote on the issues. And we collected all those at the board level, and we adopt positions only on the basis of consensus. It's not a legislative process, 50% plus one. It has to be at least a 70% agreement among the membership that's participating before we would go so far as to take an official position. Next slide. So, so this is the January 2019 report has been provided to you, and it has all the details of the background. Next slide. So the following positions achieved into the high 80s and 90% of participating members. Next slide. Our membership overwhelmingly supports appointment by the governor, supports appointment to fixed staggered terms, removed only for cause. Members should have the most important qualifications for a member are regional perspective, knowledge of regional issues, demographic diversity, and the ability to meet the time requirements of service. Members should not be local elected officials, nor should they be directly elected. And there was also a very strong support for the nominating committee process. So all of these positions were adopted by over 80, and in some cases over 90% of all the members who met during those chilly months of January and February 2019. That's my position, Madam Chair. I'd be happy to, and maybe one more point in closing. So we had members in the membership of the League of Women Voters in the metro area had two important roles in this process. One, they went out and did the interviews of local folks. And then secondly, they came together in meetings to discuss these somewhat narrow but extremely interesting issues. So I owe a personal debt of gratitude to all the members who participated in these processes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And the report has been provided to the members. So any questions for Ms. Schaefer? Connie?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question, Ms. Schaefer, and I apologize for my ignorance, not being familiar with the organization and your membership. What is the makeup of the membership, of your membership? And I appreciate the consensus votes and all that, but I'm trying to figure out what does that entail? Is it all cities, counties? Is it the whole region, or is it individuals? Is it a position of an agency, or could you explain that a little bit? Thank you.
Well, the League of Women Voters exists at the local, regional, and state level. Each local areas have a chapter, and the members who live in that area pay dues and sign up for the newsletter and go to meetings. And they elect their own officers. So my organization, the CMAL, when a local member becomes a member of, say, the Dakota County League or the Golden Valley League, every member who is a member of a local league is automatically one of our members. So there are 19 chapters, but not every city has a chapter. I don't think there's a single league chapter in Scott County, for example. And so all of those members, it's somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 individual people, and they meet in their own local meetings. And we did have a major meeting for our membership on this project, and we heard from Deb Dyson and other people giving us information. Did I answer that?
All right, thank you. Mayor Hovland, did you have a question? We've got about a minute left until we have to move on to the next presenter.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Schaefer, with respect to the consensus items that you articulated, you mentioned that the nominating committee should recommend a slate of candidates to the governor. Did you make any comment or reach any conclusion by way of consensus as to whether the governor should be required to appoint from that slate of candidates, or whether he had any kind of flexibility outside that slate that was recommended?
Mayor Hovland and Madam Chair and members, we did discuss that question about what's the appropriate flexibility for the governor. And the members did not take a position on that. I think the sense of the comments that I heard and saw was that he probably should have some flexibility, but that he should have to, or she should have to maybe make an explanation, but there was not a strong consensus on that.
Okay. And then if you send your membership materials to Connie Sahibjam, he'll think about joining. I'll sponsor him.
Okay.
There we go. Sounds like a plan. All right. Thank you, Karen, for your presentation and all your good work in this matter.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
All right, thank you. With that, we're going to move on to MICA, the Minnesota Inter-County Association. I have listed Commissioner Beard and Director Matt Mossman as presenters for this group. So,
Madam Chair,
gentlemen, take it from there.
I've unmuted my mic. Can you hear me okay? Am I on? I see heads nodding.
Yep,
So
yep, you're working. Go ahead,
right.
Commissioner.
Good deal. Thank you, Chair Holberg, committee members. First of all, for your service on this Blue Ribbon Committee. We're talking about Met Council governance again, one of my favorite subjects when I was in the legislature. But we appreciate your work and the opportunity to provide input as the Minnesota Inter-County Association as you consider your recommendations for the governor. We also appreciate the governor starting this initiative to engage these perspectives again and in an effort to hopefully achieve a satisfactory resolution, at least from our perspective, to this long-standing policy discussion. In a moment, you're going to hear from Ann Goring, who will provide a compelling legal analysis concluding that the current composition of the Metropolitan Council does not indeed satisfy federal membership requirements for an MPO. Additionally, it's worth noting that our council in the Metropolitan Council is the only one of 402 MPOs in the entire United States for which the members are entirely appointed by the governor and for which there is a stipulation that none of them can be local elected officials. None. We're the only one out of 402 that actually has that stipulation. So we share the concern that the Met Council's current structure is probably misaligned with the federal statute and certainly doesn't comport with the policy intent of Congress when they mandated that local elected officials would have a role in the decision-making in MPO governance. That's an important note because it's that policy and the principles that underlie that expectation that regional governance must include local elected officials in the decision-making. I want to talk about that today on behalf of MICA. It's important because the Met Council responsibility and authority has evolved over the last 60 years to include much more than just being a coordinating planning agency for the Twin Cities area, promoting orderly development and so on in the region. The council also has become to operate many key regional services. Optimal outcomes for Minnesotans, for consumers, taxpayers, and residents, they're most likely to be achieved if those planning the regional services are collaborative and integrated with the county and city folks who actually have to operate those things and actually live under those policy goals. For example, over time, the responsibility and the authority of the counties, and I want to talk about the counties in particular and why we're interested in this, they've also evolved as counties now have undertaken the direct provision of regional services such as hazardous and solid waste management, which we didn't used to do, transit funding and transitway development, regional parks. We've regionalized parks, greenways, bikeways, and trails. We worked closely with the Met Council on that. We're now in charge with preserving farmland and open space and do preservation work there. We're intimately involved in the regional highway network with Metropolitan Council transit planners and MnDOT. We're involved in water resource planning and watershed management. We've now regionalized the library system and with that, the fiber communication networks. And we were intimately involved in updating the 800 megahertz radio network, a big regional program that involved the counties pretty intimately. And frankly, counties are also involved in zoning and land use planning in our unincorporated township areas. Most of us are. I think Hennepin might be the only one that's not. The regional governance structure we now have offers, and we think, too much potential for parallel rather than integrative efforts. The discussion that you're engaging today and that we're being part of is not about rehashing past decisions. I want to make that clear. This isn't about the past. This is about discussing whether there's a better structure, a governance structure that would not only comport with federal policy and federal law, but would strengthen important linkages between the communities, the electorate, the taxpayers, and local elected officials and other stakeholders with the rules and the regulations being promulgated by the Metropolitan Council. The decision-making authority should be run in such a way that's visionary yet pragmatic, deliberative and nimble, accountable. The big word is accountable to the very people being governed and to the their local elected officials who have to implement and live with the rules and policies that are being promulgated. I want to make it clear that everyone that we work with at MICA and with the Suburban County Association supports the concept of a regional approach. Nobody that we affiliate with has any wish to abolish the council or diminish the importance of regional collaboration. I want to make that very clear. What we support, though, is the concept that the local elected officials who are being governed should indeed be a very important part of creating those policies and those regulations that the region has to work under. So what we urge are the following: that a majority of the Metropolitan Council members be elected officials, and I want to be very clear, not an elected council. We're adamantly opposed to an elected council, but that elected officials be appointed and selected from the cities and counties within the region, that each of the seven metropolitan counties directly appoint their own representative to the Metropolitan Council, and that additionally the terms and offices of any Metropolitan Council members that are appointed by the governor in a new governance scenario should be staggered and not entirely coterminous with the governor. That's for continuity purposes. And finally, that the voting of the new council be based on population in a way but incorporates a system of checks and balances and takes proportionality into account. Madam Chair, I thank you for the ability to make a few comments and stimulate some thoughts that may run counter to some of the things you've just heard. And with me today also is the executive director of MICA, Matt Massman, who replaced, of course, Keith Carlson, and we all knew and loved. Matt's doing a great job. He's here with me to answer any questions or further illuminate any of the comments, should there be any questions or comments.
Okay, all right. So we went a little beyond the 5 minutes. We're holding 10 minutes total, so we do have time for questions. Are there any questions of Commissioner Beard? Commissioner McGuire.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me? I'm wearing a headset. Is it okay? Can you hear me?
You're pretty scratchy.
Yeah, it's pretty scratchy.
Okay, let me take it off. Let me take it off here. I can disconnect it. Sorry about that.
Can you hear me now?
Much better.
Better? Okay. Those headsets. Okay. Thank you so much for all of these presentations, Commissioner Beard. As a county commissioner, there's a few of us on the line. I'm curious how you do see the timing of a like, if as Ramsey County might appoint one of us to be on the Met Council, there's a huge time commitment, I think, to be on the council. So if you could comment, and I think that I remember Mayor Hovland brought this up at a previous meeting also. I'm not necessarily opposed to having elected officials appointed, but I am concerned about the time commitment. And if you've thought about that.
Madam Chair, Commissioner McGuire, yes, it's been discussed at length in a couple of the different venues where we've talked about how we would make this work. And I think the ability for a commissioner to dedicate the time and the skill to making it work would certainly weigh into the selection process, who colleagues on the board would select. You certainly, I know in Scott County, that we weren't going to select someone who is, for instance, running another company on the outside and has no time to be coming to council meetings and the public interface and things like that. We wouldn't select someone like that, and I expect every county would do that. But I think it would behoove us to make the commitment if we want to run for that position or be appointed to that position. We'll just make the time.
Wow.
Anything else, Commissioner McGuire?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sure I will, but I'll let someone else ask a question now.
Okay, it looks like we've got Mayor Coates with a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question, Commissioner Beard, is this. How did you process through local elected officials, not commissioners on the county, but municipalities? Because that has been discussed in many ways, and some of the solutions that have come up I don't agree with.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Madam Mayor. Good to see you again, by the way. It's been a while. We've talked about that. There's a couple scenarios that seem that they would work, and we've patterned them after some of the other MPOs around the nation who are doing pretty much the same thing we're proposing. In the Metropolitan Council districts right now, there's proportionality and equal representation in 16 commissioner districts. The proposal we floated for a starting point, and one I think that has merit, is that the city council members or mayors would actually divide up the 16 positions that exist now, the districts that exist now, and select a member from within each district to represent the city interests. The counties would just have one on top of that, so there would be 23 elected officials plus anyone else that the governor or the legislature saw fit to add. That's just one of many that we could spend a half an hour discussing.
Thank you. That has also been discussed in other groups that I've been involved with. Yeah, and it has been mentioned earlier, in which it's true, when I was in a task force also with the Citizens League. The comprehensive plan and many of the actions that the Met Council deals with is with land use. And also with stormwater and sewage and all of that comes out of cities.
Yes.
So a lot of that activity is within cities.
What took me by surprise, Madam Chair, when I became a commissioner was how much stormwater and watershed districts and land use planning the counties are actually involved in outside the city incorporated areas. We actually have to, the counties actually do comprehensive plans as well. That was, an eye opener.
And Commissioner Beard, I agree with you. I have not looked at ditches the same since I learned more about the characteristics and roles of the county in rural Dakota County. So ditches serve a purpose.
Madam Chair, I'm the proud chairman of the LeSueur-Scott Joint Ditch Authority.
Okay, there you go. All right. So on that note, any other questions for the MICA group? We're over their 10 minutes, so we should probably move on.
Certainly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Good to see you again, Commissioner and Matt. And last but not least is Ann Gearing, who has a presentation on behalf of the Metro Governance Transportation Initiative, which Commissioner Beard referenced in his comments. So, Ann,
thank you.
There you are. Welcome to the committee.
Well, thank you for having me today. You probably have, we've sent you a letter I wrote in 2015, which is a very dense, I'm sure you're all of the lawyers on here and the non-lawyers really enjoy looking at a 10-page, very dense recitation of federal statutory construction, because that's a lot of fun for everybody. That's my little joke. And for those of you that don't enjoy that, I wrote a shorter 3-page, very dense recitation of federal statutory construction. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. I understand that this is not something anybody likes because it's an inconvenient fact of this discussion, the federal statute that involves, and I make it clear here, there's a lot of what you're talking about that does not involve the designation of the MPO. And so I'm here limiting my discussion to the transportation piece and the designation of the MPO and designation, the membership on the MPO. But it is an issue that does need to be addressed. It's quite clear that whatever you do here, at some point, and I believe that you are not legal, that that council is not legally in compliance with respect to the federal requirements of an MPO. It is set out in statute. It is quite clear, whether before 2012 amendments or since then, the language is quite clear. It states there was a change that says not later than 2 years after the enactment of MAP 21, which was 2014. Each metropolitan planning organization that serves a transportation management area, which you do, shall consist of local elected officials. That isn't a suggestion. It's not a hope. It's not a anything. It shall consist of. And the law was changed by Congress. This is whether you believe, and I certainly disagree, and it's set forth in my materials, that the grandfathering language does not apply. The grandfathering language is misapplied. That is the intent of Congress, that you have to have local elected officials on the MPO. That the tab is not the MPO, that you have to have local elected officials on it. That is the intent of Congress, and that is the language in the statute. And so whatever you're doing going forward with respect to that, that is a requirement of the law. And looking at what all of the other MPOs, 402 around the country, have met this requirement. I think the concern here is that people throughout the testimony today have talked about whether the tab should still be an advisory committee. There is some type of conflict of interest. It can't be too significant of a conflict of interest if over 400 other MPOs have successfully had local elected officials on, potentially for some of them for decades. And certainly all of them have been in compliance since the change in the law in 2012. So I don't see that that is an issue, and I think that this is the opportunity that the Met Council, through any change in legislation, has to bring itself into compliance. One of the things that I think you have to recognize, this organization and the panel here should recognize, is the Met Council is at some risk, either through potential litigation or a change in the administration who's looking at this. We had some local administrators looking at this and saying, we think it's okay. It could maybe grandfathered under some language, but there could be a change in this personnel who said it was okay, that it was grandfathered in. I think it was a mistake on their part. There can be a change in administrators at the federal level who will look at it differently. And that puts you at risk of being not in compliance with the federal law. They can come back and change their mind, look at this again in the future. There has been some indication that there will be another look at this information and the compliance issue, or there could be litigation or challenge under the Administrative Procedures Act. So while there's a letter that says we think you're okay, that letter also says you should get into compliance with the federal law. And the language is quite clear that you're not. So our organization is encouraging that the opportunity is here to have the MPO be in compliance and have local elected officials on there. I understand that there may be people who are saying, we don't want to do that, it's inconvenient, it doesn't meet our goals or our thoughts on this. But the fact is, Congress set that policy, and that is what the federal legislation says. That is where the money is coming from, and they're saying that this is the requirement. That should be taken into account very seriously in going forward and making any changes.
So you came the closest to 5 minutes, so good job. Any questions?
I spend a lot of time in courts with judges having red flashing lights at me.
Right, I kind of figured that, but I was going to give you kudos and credit anyway. So any questions for Ann? Tom Weaver. Tom, did you have a question? You got to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Ms. Gehring, for your analysis. We were provided with a letter with actually the FTA and Federal Highway Administration's response to your letter earlier, and they clearly disagree with your analysis. At least they did in 2016. Have there been any changes in circumstances or new information since that time that would change their view of this issue?
My view is, first of all, I disagree with them. They're local administrators. They are looking at, legally, I disagree with them. and it has not been decided by a court. It hasn't been decided through the Administrative Procedures Act. So I disagree with their legal analysis. We have talked to the legal counsel at a federal highway, and they were looking at this as to whether or not that decision was made correctly. This was not made, this wasn't a decision or a opinion that came out of their legal office. So there, at least the chief attorney was looking at this within the last year and questioning whether that opinion was correct. So it is always possible that this opinion it isn't a binding opinion. It is an opinion of some administrators saying, we think they were grandfathered. But as I said, this is not a binding, it isn't a legal opinion from a court saying, we have binding authority, we're issuing an opinion that a judge has come down on or a court of appeals has come down on. The chief attorney's office has taken another look at this and said, we are going to take another look. They could change their mind at any time. And that is what makes that position vulnerable. While you are not in compliance with the statute, they can always change their mind on this and say, nope, you've got to come into compliance. So this is an opportunity that you have to, yes, put the local elected officials onto the Met Council as the statute requires. They are relying wholly on a grandfathering provision saying that this organization hasn't changed in any way since 1991. And I think that that is simply inaccurate. You have changed since 1991.
Is there anything from the chief attorney's office that puts them on record questioning the validity of this letter?
There isn't a letter from them at this time. The person, the chief attorney, Mark Lilly, who was looking at this, left to go back into private practice, and another attorney is there.
Thank you.
I think people are muted or waving their hands.
All right, Mayor Hovland, did you have a question?
I thought I recalled that this issue had been subject to some litigation, that Scott County had actually sued on this issue some years ago, but maybe I'm mistaken about that.
Yeah, I don't think it was settled legally.
Okay.
To the satisfaction of attorneys, but
there was no lawsuit.
All right, thank you.
So, Connie, did you have a question?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. My question was, since you did not receive a agreement letter from the local administrator, did you try to go to the national level, to USDOT level above these folks? Back from my olden days at the DOT, when sometimes when the law was not black or white and was somewhat gray, sometimes you go to the next level. Did you try to do that?
So of course, this is subject to which client wants me to do what, but that is when we went and discussed this with Federal Highway within the last year. And as I said, the chief attorney was looking at this, then he went back into private practice and has been pushed on to another attorney.
So maybe if I might, Ann, would you say that there is continued interest in a more definitive answer on this issue by various organizations that you worked with?
I would say that there is continued interest. There has been discussion at the federal level with federal agencies to continue to look at this. Yes. Hopefully, I would also say that they're very hopeful that there will just be an agreement through this panel. This was a very hopeful idea that this panel and potential changes would simply resolve the issue. It is clearly the intent of Congress, if you look at the clear language, when they say no later than 2014, you must have local elected officials, and even the letter from Federal Highway asking that you move forward in coming into compliance voluntarily rather than through any sort of other process, that is the intent, to have local elected officials on there. So no matter whether you're looking at the statute itself or their letter saying, we think there was grandfathering, but you should still do the right thing and come into compliance, in accordance with the intent of Congress. That is what their letter says. You should be in compliance with the statute, even if there is a grandfathering provision. So I understand that there is reluctance to do that because Met Council has been the way it's been for 40 years, but the statute is what the statute is. And that is, you know, it's an inconvenient fact, but it is a fact.
All righty. Any other questions for Ann before we wrap up for today? Mayor Hovland.
I would just comment that 40 years under this model has to have some basis in legality. So I thought that comment was a little bit adversarial, if you will, not helpful.
It isn't meant to be adversarial. The Congress changed the law in 2012. So while
and this, the letter that we got since came after 2012, I take it, because of the inquiry of several of your clients about the hybrid model that we use and its legitimacy. And it was determined that the hybrid model that we use with the tab advising the Met Council is a legally satisfactory model.
Well, we can dispute that. They said that it was grandfathered.
Well, is that legally satisfactory or not?
I think that's the
Mr. Hovland, I would weigh in here and say that the language from that letter says that nothing in this subsection shall be construed to interfere with the authority of any state law in effect. And so I think it's pretty clear.
All right. Thank you.
Pat has his hand up if you're done, Mayor Hovland. Pat.
Yeah, Madam Chair, not a question for Ann, but just if we want to take this up again, we might want to hear from some attorney at the Met Council to get their point of view about this too. We've heard from one advocate who has a point of view about the law and their discussions with federal authorities. I think there have been lots of discussions with federal authorities over quite a long period of time, and we might want to hear that if we choose to do that from another advocate.
Okay, good point. Any other quick questions for Ann? Otherwise, we're going to move on to what's next. All right, thank you, Ann. Appreciate the information. So, Pat, you kind of lay out a nice segue into where we go next with this. We'll meet in another 2 weeks. We've now had a number of presentations by different organizations, lots and lots of homework information provided. I know you've all read every page and every word of all the materials we receive, so you're ready for the term paper here pretty soon. So I think that for one item, we're going to take a look at the metro mobility versus how transit for the disability and the ADA community is provided in greater Minnesota, some of the similarities and difference in how that is funded. Sounds like we should maybe gather some information on the legal MPO issue from a Met Council attorney. And then if any of you have any other items that you think we should look for information at the meeting in 2 weeks, otherwise we're going to have to start working on a process to nail down some recommendations here. And given this Zoom meeting format, I'm still scratching my head a little bit about how we get there. It would seem like a lot easier to get her in a room and hash it out, but I don't think that's going to be an option before the end of the year. So any comments, input, additional information, questions? Pat?
Well, I'm struggling to know how we're going to proceed at this point, but I do think that maybe a quick round robin by everybody on initial impressions might help put some issues on the table for us. I know there are 15 of us. You've been a very good time sheriff, Mary Liz. You could keep the mouthy ones of us in control. But if we each had a minute or so to just express initial impressions and direction, maybe we'd see some coalescence around one or more recommendations or findings, just to see where the group is.
And Pat, would you, are you thinking today or at our next meeting?
No, at the next meeting. I think we'd need a little, I think everybody should be given a little prep time and a little homework. And that's, you know, we've been listening to people make presentations and reading materials. Maybe it's now time for us to chat among ourselves. You know, maybe we do a round of that. And then, you know, I've seen some of these video chats where people divide into small groups. I don't know if that's possible under this structure, either technically, or if that's something we should or shouldn't do from a standpoint of how can we make this public. Maybe we just can't do small groups and shouldn't, perhaps, but you know, that's just my initial idea.
All right, show of thumbs up or heads shaking. You like Pat's idea of next meeting, kind of do a round robin, and maybe, okay, looks like we've got consensus of thumbs up on that. And then maybe in the meantime, maybe Pat, you and I can have a little discussion, maybe provide a little bit more framework ahead of time so people can maybe think about the various policy positions we might want to provide feedback on.
Yeah, you know, Madam Chair, there are probably, you know, a limited number of questions before us that we've been asked to consider. It's not, you know, the field in front of us is not so wide open that it's untenable. I think there are probably a limited number of choices here that about governance that we can take up.
Well, I think there's a lot of policy experts here. There's a lot of people here that have the battle scars, bruises for decades of Met Council reform discussions, actions. And so I agree with you that there's, you know, we're not going to need to spend a lot of time. Does anybody else want to provide any more comments on this idea?
Just, Madam Chair, I seem to get stuck between the governance, overall governance, and then like today, most of the presentations was about that, and then there was one about transit. So I start thinking about transit and trying to think about that whole thing. And I wonder if it's be separated, the conversation, those, you know, only talk about the governance, and then once that's figured out, that will get the conversation with the transit. And you can't figure out transit without having the governance. Have some recommendations on that. So,
well, and I think you also have the MPO issue as a form of governance, and so I think you're right. It's a little bit of the bowl of spaghetti, but I think we can kind of pull it apart, not completely, but enough that we can start framing up. The one thing that we have gotten very little information about, and I don't know if anybody's interested, but is anybody heading towards like an all-elected Met Council? Is there anybody that wants to hear from Portland and their model? Or I hear heads shake, see heads shaking no, so okay, well that makes that one easier. and Judd has a thumbs up to that. So we won't explore the Portland model as a matter of homework. Anything else before we adjourn? Maybe a minute early. No? All right. Well, everybody be safe. We'll see you again in 2 weeks, and watch for some information materials to come out a little ahead of time to frame up our discussion at the next meeting. So thank you, everybody, and all our presenters. Take care.